Well, welcome everyone to Panmure House on what is a beautiful sunny day here in Edinburgh. We are recording this for our millions of YouTube followers who will then buy Robbie's book. But I guess the one issue with people buying Robbie's book, if he becomes really rich out of this, he might retire early, and I don't think anybody wants to see him go pretty soon. Just to say, so I'm Adam Dixon. I'm the Adam Smith Chair here at Panmure House, also part of EBS and Heriot-Watt, so a colleague of Robbie. And I'll introduce Robbie in a minute here. But I heard Robbie was publishing a book just before Christmas, I believe. Mm-hmm. He was saying, I've got this great book coming out called How to Think Like an Economist. And I thought to myself, what a fantastic book title, for one. But more importantly, what a fantastic book to launch or to showcase here at Panmure House. Now, I think everyone in this room, and ideally those that are watching this video, know that this is the last home of Adam Smith, who has a chapter in this book, and if you could tell, is one of the pictures here, though Adam Smith actually never sat for a portrait, so this is just an estimation, but I think it looks good. Mm-hmm. And so I think, Smith's birthday was a few days ago. What we know is, depending on the calendar you use.
Yeah, if we're using the Julian calendar, it's not for another 2 weeks.
Not for another 2 weeks, right. But if we want to go old school and Gregorian, then we can say it was on the 5th of June.
And technically, we don't know when he was born. We only know when he was baptized.
So let's just say that sometime around May, June, about 301 years ago, one of the greatest thinkers to have ever lived was born just across the water and lived here for the last 12 years of his life. And so it is a special place. We're sitting in the room where Adam Smith completed his final editions of his two great masterworks, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, in addition to working on other books, or at least one book that was never finished, and who knows what else he was working on. And so just so you know, when you're in here, this is, at least for me, a special place to be, and it's a special place to discuss what economics is, what economics was, and perhaps what economics will become. So on that note, I want to welcome Robbie Mochrie, our speaker today, who has written this fantastic book, which I've read, and which we were selling downstairs, but it might have already sold out. So if you haven't been able to get a copy of this, please do go and buy it at your local bookstore or order it from Amazon. But Robbie's, I just want to read what they say about him on the bio on the last page, and it says, Dr. Robbie Mochrie is an economics teacher with over 30 years of experience. Adept at equipping undergraduates with new skills, but comfortable with working with business and political leaders. He had until recently, as he tells me, a regular economics commentary at The National, which is a newspaper here in Scotland, while working closely with churches and credit unions. And why I want to read this bio is because I think it actually shows that Robbie was the right person to write this book. In fact, I think many economists probably couldn't write a book. And this is not to disparage any economist that couldn't write this book that spans more than 300 years of economic history. And I think Robbie's work, spending 30 years teaching economics, having to think about what it is, and importantly, how to explain it to young people, means that he was well placed to write this book. And so on that note, I'm going to ask Robbie a few questions. And then at some point, when I get tired of badgering him and questioning his decisions on who to include and not to include in the book, we'll open up the floor to questions. So as the title says, How to Think Like an Economist. That's the title. And your book covers a broad swathe of the history of economic thought. And you focus particularly in the book on economics as primarily the management of resources. Mm-hmm. But before we, in most of the book kind of touches on how different economists have thought about how we manage resources. But I'd like you to say a bit more before we define what is an economist as a person, as a thinker. What do we mean by, or what do you take as the economy?
Right. I'm glad we're starting with the simple questions.
Yes.
Now, I suppose that when I was actually writing the foreword in which I talk about the economy in terms of resources in particular, that what I had in mind was not near, and in fact, it's not so much the resources, it's the management of resources, it's the way in which we relate to resources. So it's not just something that is out there, it's something that involves people. I talk in the foreword as well, that there are ways in which economists think about people as resources themselves, so that there's something very reflexive about what's involved with that. And I suppose that actually what I would be saying is, well, you've got to look at the world in a particular way, and then you start to see the world as the economy. And the economy is a whole load of relationships. The economy is, it involves buying and selling, it involves trading, it involves values. So essentially it's a way of thinking about the material world, but which transforms the material world into value terms, not just financial value terms, but value more generally. And so where the economy is, it's all around this room, it permeates us, and we're all part of it ourselves. So I suppose actually where I'm getting to is something like pre-Clerk Maxwell physics, Newtonian physics. You need the ether, and the economy is like the ether. We can't see it, we can't measure it, but it is there.
But then, to ask a harder question, what about all these other things? Right? What about the political? How does the political fit into your definition of the economy? How does the social, right? So you mentioned values, right? So
Yes.
how do we understand the messiness of life in that management of resources in what we call the economy?
Sure. The first thing that I will say here, and this is I think one of the things that distinguishes economists from other thinkers about society generally, is that economists enjoy that messiness. So economists, and this is, we're in Adam Smith's house, obviously I have to mention the invisible hand at some stage, so let's get it on, well, no, let's not put it on the table to start off with. But let's acknowledge the invisible hand early on in the conversation, and this idea that Smith had, which is one of his fundamental ideas, that the economy is self-organizing, that there isn't any need for somebody to give orders to command how resources are going to flow from people. The way that, in fact, when I'm teaching even first-year students, I say, well, what is the purpose of a market? A market exists to take resources from the people who own them to the people who value them most. And the distribution that you're going to end up with is pursuing value. So the economy is all about creating, generating, transferring value in those sorts of ways.
But is that...
Sorry, and
Yeah?
you did say about political.
Yes.
Right, so, and well, you mentioned Smith, there's a chapter on Smith, but that's chapter 3. Before we get to Smith, we have to start off with, I think, the ancient Greeks, where fundamental ideas about the economy began. And of course, Smith never thought about, and indeed until the middle of the 18th century, people didn't talk about economics. People in the early capitalist period after the Industrial Revolution would talk about political economy. And so if you think about what the purpose of Smith was, his book is called The Wealth of Nations. It is a question, really, I would say, that what Smith was thinking about at the start is, how do we actually take the fact that we've now reached a stage in economic development where it is possible to imagine growth carrying on, and growth carrying on because capital is going to develop. And if you actually get to the end of The Wealth of Nations, you find out that Smith actually believes that the wealth of nations comes not from the accumulation of treasure, which is what he'd been arguing against for about 800 pages by this stage, but it comes from what we now call human capital. And so Smith believed very strongly in education as being the way in which we would actually learn to coordinate resources better so that society could prosper. And Smith was always thinking about society, always thinking in political terms, never thinking about individual relationships.
So I want to ask you a political question, though, right? Because the definition you give of an economy and a market, is it not a liberal definition that you give? In the sense that if we think about the ancient Greeks, it was still a slave-owning society.
Yes.
I mean, Smith was writing about trying to understand, well, how do we come out of this feudal period to where markets came about? And so how would you then put economy in that frame, where we've had, even in the kind of post-Smith era, for many decades thereafter, we had, you know, a slave trading system, and this is not just to pick on slave trading, but many things that aren't actually kind of, you know, it's a risk to depoliticize the economy as something that's just markets and trade, when actually you have these social forces, often which are shaped by politics in a way that you can't just say markets are about trade.
No, indeed. And I think you've actually touched on something which economics has always been a little bit nervous about. Now, firstly, I would say, I mean, I heard Deirdre McCloskey talking about Smith at the end of last year, and Glory Liu, who was when she was talking here last year as well, emphasised that Smith writes so broadly that everyone from Marxists to libertarians can look back at the Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments and says that defines my economics. So Smith is the last common ancestor, effectively. And the second Adam, really, I suppose, in that sense. And what we have in Adam Smith's, in the way that people have taken from Smith, is much more interest, and I think perhaps you're starting to hint at this, that economics is a very narrow definition of efficiency. And that means that all sorts of questions which are really important for understanding society, even as simple ones as what the distribution of income and wealth are going to look like, don't fit naturally into standard economic analysis. And so, the Association for Social Economics is meeting in Boston just at the moment, and they will be arguing about economics in a way which I think it would be fair to say to most conventional economists would be more or less incomprehensible. And the questions they're interested in just wouldn't be interesting to more conventional economists.
So that actually brings me to my second question. I do want to come back to this kind of issue of different fields of economic thought. But then, what is an economist then? Who is one? Who can count as one? I mean, these are kind of epistemic communities that come up, and it's often it can be very contingent on even the country you're in, right? I mean, so what is the term an economist in the United States might be someone that has a PhD in economics. Here in the UK, it might be a bit more flexible. It's different in other countries. So what is an economist? What makes someone an economist? Or let me ask two questions. What makes an economist today in 2024? What made an economist in 1924? And what made an economist in 1824?
Right, so...
Sorry for that very long...
Well, I can actually do this quite neatly, because 1824 is the year after Ricardo died, so we know what the standard of political economy was at that time. And so Ricardo was, we're looking at classical political economy. For Ricardo, the absolutely fundamental question was, how do we understand the distribution of wealth? 1924, Alfred Marshall dies. And Marshall is responsible for, I would have to say, an internal revolution within economic thought. So Marshall was he didn't invent it, but he popularized the supply and demand curve, supply and demand curves. He thought very much in terms of marginal analysis, and he did so in a consistent way, which means that the principles of economics was still being used as a textbook where I went to university in St Andrews until the 1960s. So Marshall, and when Samuelson, Paul Samuelson was a postgraduate student in at Harvard. That was at the time when Harvard hired Joseph Schumpeter to teach mathematical economics. And Schumpeter used the appendix in Marshall's Principles, which had been published 45 years before. So Marshall didn't like using mathematics in the Principles himself, but as a very good mathematician, as a second wrangler at Cambridge, understood the capabilities of mathematics as a way of expressing economic ideas. And the marginal revolution, I would say, that Marshall, for which Marshall isn't at the forefront of it, but Marshall synthesizes and makes it and systematizes it so that it becomes the foundation of what people think of economics. Now, he thought of the purpose of economics as being profit maximization in free competition. So Marshall was thinking very much in terms of 19th century firms, which were small, atomistic, hadn't got out of the ideas that Joan Robinson or Edwin Chamberlain would in the 1930s of monopolistic competition. Those would be complications, but also thought effectively as monopoly as being, and oligopoly as being not consistent with the fundamental economic model. Then what does an economist mean? Well, clearly the next great change, in 1924, Marshall dies. He is memorialized by John Maynard Keynes. And so effectively that until about 20 years ago, Keynes's obituary was the standard biography of Marshall. Now, of course, Keynes also put it into the Essays in Biography, which you can read as saying effectively, all these great people are just precursors for me and my great life. So Keynes, I think, is the only person who really questions what Adam Smith was up to in economics in many ways, or sorry, in conventional economics. Once you get beyond Keynes, you're into unconventional economics, I would say. And what Keynes really, I would say, was thinking in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, of the fact that we had unemployment, and in economic terms, clearly unemployment is inefficient. So 25% unemployment, grossly inefficient. What's the answer? Well, I'm going to try and give a summary of what I think Keynes thought Smith was saying, which is that supply would come about through invention, and that would mean that people were essentially seeking for profit, as Marshall had predicted. You can think about that as being the greed motive in the economy. And then people were wanting to satisfy their needs. So the economy is where need meets greed, and classical economics, Marshall's neoclassical economics as well, says need and greed will combine so that there is only one possible outcome. What I think Keynes was saying is you've got to bring the emotions in, you've got to bring psychology in, and then it is possible, as he was looking around the economy at the end of 1932 in particular, early 1933, as the US banking system nearly failed completely, that what we see is fear can corrode the economy. And it was fear which had caused the Great Depression. Two people who certainly understood that, Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they just fought a presidential election. How do we address the problem of fear which is gripping the American society, not just the economy, but it was an economic problem as well.
So then what does it mean to be an economist in 2024 now? Right, so I guess it was Marshall and then Keynes. Keynes was for more kind of a managed economy intervention.
Yes.
After Keynes, you get the likes of Friedman, with some Hayek in there, saying hands off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fast forward to 2024, where governments are trying to fight over who can subsidize industry as fast as it can. Here in the UK, there's not much firepower to do so. But if you look at what the United States is doing, it's massive. So, Keynes is still alive and well to a certain degree.
No,
not in the same way, but if we take him as kind of a proponent of an active state.
Yes.
We're not in a Friedmanite period.
Oh gosh, no.
But again, then what does it mean to be an economist now?
Now, There, I think you're actually, and you mentioned Hayek, and I think that Hayek and Keynes had this very interesting debate that went on through the 1930s and into the 1940s, where Keynes expressed interest in the idea of planning. And I think that this is the difference between them. They were both fundamentally liberals, but Keynes believed in positive freedom very much, or believed positive freedom was absolutely essential. Negative freedom was essential. So freedom from fear, freedom from want, those kinds of issues. Whereas Hayek believed freedom to act was the absolutely fundamental liberty which had to be preserved. And so Keynes, I think it would have been very interesting if Keynes had survived a little bit longer, because he was already quite critical of the tendency of the Attlee government to start thinking about nationalisation. That was, that was far too much direction in the economy for him. But where we are now, well, I would say yes, particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, there has been a revival of interest in the kind of arguments which Keynes has said about, or that Keynes is associated with, about the importance of planning within the economy.
Right. So I'd like to,
and that's where we start to get the political coming back in.
So the part of our talk is to entice you to buy Robbie's book, to read the narrative. So we're not going to cannibalize book sales, but I'd like to switch to a discussion of why you chose the thinkers that you did. So in effect, what is your method of inclusion, right? So you go from Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, Jevons, Menger, Walras, Marshall, Schumpeter, Keynes, Hayek, von Neumann, Ronald Coase, Friedman, Samuelson, Herbert Simon, Schelling, Solow, Becker, Elinor Ostrom. There are two women in the book, thankfully, who was a political scientist, and you even refer to her as a political scientist. Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, psychologists, Robert Lucas, Akerlof, and then ending with a woman, Esther Duflo. Obviously, when anyone sits down to write a book, it's half of the battle is deciding what's the book about and who do I include and what's not included. So I'm curious how you came to choose this list. I mean, some are quite obvious. I mean, Adam Smith has to be in there, Karl Marx has to be in there, John Maynard Keynes has to be in there, and you can find a few others that would have to be Schumpeter, likewise, probably Hayek, Samuelson for various reasons, Marshall as well. But then, what about the others? How did you decide on Elinor Ostrom for one? I mean, when she won the Nobel Prize, there was some consternation.
Who is this woman?
I mean, she was, I knew of Ostrom's work and I thought it was fantastic that she won, but there was some kind of consternation that it wasn't the issue that they gave it to a woman, it was that they gave it to someone that wasn't part of the Economists tribe, if you like. So how did you decide that?
It's very, just in that, before we get into Ostrom herself, it's very interesting reading Herbert Simon's autobiography, where he explains at great length why he really should have won, why it was perfectly natural for him to have won a Nobel Memorial Prize. What he doesn't mention is that he campaigned actively for it for about 5 years. Now, how did I include things? Well, if I can come to I'll deal with the question of how to include women and how to deal with women, because this was the one thing which became controversial.
Well, this is going to get really interesting.
Essentially, I was told there weren't enough women, and I said, go and look at Economists, the list of economists that, and editors were coming back from the United States going, he's right, there aren't many women economists. So what I ended up doing was finding all these wives, particularly, who had influenced their husbands' economics. Starts with Harriet Taylor, who John Stuart Mill actually at one stage wanted to have as a co-author. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, At the time, Harriet Taylor was still married to John Taylor, who said no, very firmly. So women have had a role in economics long before. I think that actually what I ended up doing was showing how women gradually moved into economics as society changed. It wasn't that economics was particularly opposed to women thinking about the economy. It was that society was fairly much biased against them. So that was one of the things. And I did want, the second thing was that the second half of the book is all people who have won the Nobel Prize. So I wanted that to be a criterion of recognized excellence. In some ways to say, these are what great problems are in economics. Now, the challenge with that is that the way that we award a Nobel Prize in economics is a kind of like a lifetime achievement medal. So I suppose I could have spread it slightly more widely, but then it restricts it to Americans if it included John Bates Clark Medal winners. But I thought that the Nobel Prize was actually quite an interesting way of just saying, well, this gives you an idea of the width of major recent work, but even Esther Duflo's work, the main ideas were being developed about 30 years ago. So there's nothing 21st century in it. And that's something which has come up once or twice in conversations about how did you choose these. However, I suppose I'm skating round this. This book is not how to think like an economist. This book is how to think like Robbie Mochrie, an economist. And the choice, I mean, first novels very often are autobiographical. Think of this almost as, this is my first trade book. It's almost inevitably going to be autobiographical. And I suppose if you really want to know who's responsible for much of the choice of characters, it would be Rod Cross, who taught me history of thought at St Andrews as an undergraduate, and who thought that it was very important we understood Marx and Marshall and Smith and Keynes, and was open to, if I'd actually followed on from Rod, Wicksell would have got a chapter himself. But what I wanted to do was to give this feeling of, here's how economics got to the 20th century, or to the middle of the 20th century, and here's what's happened since the middle of the 20th century.
Because you could, just in thinking of the inclusion of women, I mean, had you stretched your definition of what an economist is, that could have stretched the inclusion of so for example, if including Elinor Ostrom, there are other political scientists or other kind of sociologists that you could have included. So I think this falls under the question of, I like your answer, which is the truth is that, well, you chose it because, well, you're the author and you get to choose these things, and unless an editor makes you, then you just go with it. And like any book, right? It's there's hundreds of books on the history of economic thought, and all are going to have various different inclusions. But I'm curious, though, on who did you leave out that you would have liked to have included? And as a follow-up to that, why did you not include sort of other strains of economic thought? So you mentioned the American institutionalists. So you could have had a chapter on Thorstein Veblen or Friedrich List or other thinkers that are not quite in that are actually fundamental to how we understand the economy, including the management of those resources. So who was left out and why? And if you, or maybe an easy way to answer it, if you had more time and didn't matter how long the book was, who would you have included that you didn't?
Right. So without it being a completed history, Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis.
Yeah, 1,200 pages, right? Was it? Or
1,200 pages up to 1953, and he died of a heart attack after writing on Keynes.
So,
who lived rent-free in his head for 20 years, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned the American institutionalists, and if Bob McMaster from Glasgow was here, he would say, "You've missed out Veblen. How could you do that?" In fact, he said that to me more than once. And the answer is, one of the things I wanted to do was to tell quite a nice, neat story that would actually drive through. And if I go to all the interesting side shoots of economics, I'd lose that. I was limited to 80,000 words. And gosh, there's all sorts of people I'd like to include. Vasily Leontiev, the founder of Input-Output Analysis, who 3 of his Nobel Prize winning students are in there.
But you do actually talk about him
I talk
more
about
than
Leontiev.
once in the book,
Yes,
right? So
yes,
he's
yes,
in there.
yeah. So he's in there. Ken Arrow only gets into the afterword, really. And the reason for that is I started writing a chapter and I thought, well, I'll do Samuelson and Arrow together. And Samuelson's ebullient personality just seemed to take up all the space. And Arrow, who, as Mark was reminding me, was actually a very modest man in many ways. Interesting relationship, of course, because Ken Arrow's sister married Robert Samuelson, married Robert Summers, who was Paul Samuelson's brother. Oh, and their child is Larry Summers. So that must have been interesting around the family barbecue.
Shows how small the community of economists is, actually, right?
Yes.
So any other authors that you would have, or thinkers that you would have liked to have included?
Oh, I would have liked to have said a lot more about German historicism, which would then have given me a route into American institutionalism. I have said almost nothing about econometrics. Irving Fisher isn't in there. There are just so many people that I could have included. I mean, I started off with a long list of 100. Things like I was actually onto my second draft before Ken Arrow dropped out, because I thought, this is really important, but it's actually getting in the way of the story a little bit.
Right. So one final question before I open up to the audience is, where, in your view, is economic thought going? What does it mean? And I guess I sort of asked this before, what is an economist in 2024? But what is in your view the field of conventional economics as you define it? Where is it going?
Yes. Okay, I think there are all sorts of interesting questions here. I think that one of the things which we're starting to do, which is going to be increasingly important, is starting, for example, in national income accounting, to start to include capital within that, so that we complete the national accounts in some sense, that we're actually looking at assets and liabilities, and that will give us a much better idea of that I think will actually make it much easier for us to actually start to do economics and think about welfare effects. So that means that there's a large amount of economics, and again, I haven't touched on this in the book at all. A large amount of economics in future is going to be about measurement. It's going to be about how we actually extract knowledge from data in a whole variety of ways, some of which haven't been invented yet, just to make it even more challenging to talk about. And I suppose that the other thing, which I think is actually quite important, you've mentioned the fact that we never really left a Keynesian economy. So I think that understanding how planning is going to take place, and particularly what that's going to mean for, well, the kind of work that you're doing in Panmure House, I think is going to be fundamental to the future of economics.
Okay. On that note, I'd like to open the floor to questions. There'll be a microphone that's going to come around. The microphone is only for the recording, so you don't need, as Phil has told me, to bang on the microphone to see if it works. I learned today that banging on the microphone was because it was carbon-based at one point, and banging on it in the 1920s was how you got it to work. So that's a bit of trivia for you today. So don't bang on the microphone. So we'll start you right there, and then you, and then to John.
Thanks very much, both for the book and for a very illuminating conversation. In late antiquity, I mean, you started with value and resources, Robbie, and in late antiquity, oikonomia meant management of household resources and was related to oikumene, which means the whole inhabited earth. But the earth was much, much smaller at that particular point. There is a wonderful phrase in the blurb to your book, which is, avoiding climate catastrophe will mean changing economies so that they don't bake the world. I wondered if you could say something about the task of being an economist in relation to that challenge and in relation to those questions of value and resources and who owns the world, I suppose. Sure. Small question there.
Yes, so thanks very much, Simon, for that. I think that one of the things which is important here is what I was saying. You start thinking in terms of not just, and in fact I mentioned climate change to bake the world, because I'd already talking about how in the pandemic we had to stop the economy freezing. But I think that it's not just climate change, it's also biodiversity. And so that takes us towards thinking about natural capital. A lot of what we're talking about would be social capital, which very much picks up on the points which you were making, Adam, about we can't define economics narrowly. And I suppose actually I will go back in some ways, I will go back to your ancient Greek example of the household management. In a slave-owning society, Aristotle was writing for citizens who would do no work themselves. And of course, and indeed Aristotle regarded what we would now consider as essentially economic activity as being chrematistike, and so it's suitable for people of a slavish disposition. In other words, people who would lose battles, be enslaved, and then have to manage some Athenian citizen's household. So I think that where that comes to is that one of the challenges of economics in the future is that we're going to see the dematerialization of the economy. We're going to see much less work. It's not going to be making things that's important in the economy. It's going to be much more about relationships. And I'll throw in a free bit of Keynes as well. His essays for our his economic prospects for our grandchildren. How do we live in a society in which, Veblen as well, everyone is in the leisure class?
And we have a 20-hour work week too.
Well, if you're thinking about Keynes, he was thinking about a 10-hour work week.
Yeah.
The man who worked himself to death at the age of 62.
Right. There was a question that was.
Bearing in mind the venue of us today, I thought I might try to ask a question pertinent to Smith. In his surviving writings, not just The Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments, also stands his History of Astronomy, where Smith very clearly sets out his philosophy of science as indicating that all things are indeed one part of the same. And it's relatively apparent that his economics, he thinks, is an extension of this philosophy of science. I was wondering, in your opinion, are modern theories such as planetary boundaries and systems in economics perhaps a vehicle which might be used to unite the prodigal sons and disparate tribes of economists, as you've described variously over the course of your book?
I would have to say, Jamie, that I think Owen McLaughlin, who's sitting behind you, is far better placed to answer that question than I am. But you did sit through my lectures, I think, on this, so you should know the answer, which is that I am not convinced that planetary system boundaries are an adequate approach at the moment, and that's. And indeed, that what I would see is that this is an interesting, there are various interesting points here. One is that the people who are thinking about this are the kind of people who want their economy to be nice and neat. And economists are too fond of the messiness. And that messiness comes particularly through the operation of the price system, as I mentioned, the invisible hand. And so what I think that we've got here is that this is one of the reasons why many economists are optimistic about the future in a way that other social scientists aren't, because what they see is that prices will convey information and will indicate the demand for carbon alternatives, encouraging innovation and the supply, so that very much in the way that I put it earlier on, the economy is where need meets greed, and that opportunity will divert us away from the worst risks of climate change. That's the economic answer. The planetary systems approach, of course, views it in an entirely different way because they don't take into account the operation of the price level. Okay.
question for
John, I think.
John, and then we'll take Owen.
Well, first of all, it's great pleasure to be in the room with you and to hear you teach again. I think I listened to you teach 29 years ago, Robbie, for the first time. So it's a great pleasure to hear you teach again. You've written about lots of people. Of these people, and you've spent a great deal of time with these people, of these people, which one would you like to go down the pub with and have a pint? And which one would you like to lock in a room and throw away the key?
You know, I feel that quite a lot of these people wouldn't be the sort to go down the pub and have a pint.
I mean, Smith would have taken you out for a claret. at least,
Absolutely,
right?
yes. I mean, gosh,
And raucous, right? So
if we
you were supposed to say Smith, Adam Smith. And then,
okay, no, I would only go with Smith if he'd bring human with him.
right, okay, fair enough.
Yeah. The person I'll start with the person I disliked, and that's Alfred Marshall. And there's all sorts of reasons for this. Marshall, I had to explain this to my editor, that when I said Marshall enjoyed bad health, what I meant was that he was a manipulative person who was very good at getting everyone around him to dance to attention because, I can't do it, I'm too tired. Keynes referred to Marshall as being brilliant in 15-minute bursts, but having no capacity for a longer spell of work, and which he used to explain why Marshall never finished anything. The one book which Marshall finished on time was written by his wife, who was the first woman to complete the tripos at Cambridge. Well, it wasn't an economics tripos, the moral sciences tripos in Cambridge in 1872, proposed marriage to Marshall. He agreed. And by that stage, Mary Paley had got a contract to write a book called Economics of Industry. Austin Robinson, 50 years afterwards, considered that it was better than Marshall's Principles. So
She deserved a chapter.
Yes, she deserved a chapter in many ways, but so did Joan Robinson.
Yeah,
But,
I was going to ask about Joan Robinson, why she wasn't.
I'll get to that sometime, because I'm the person that I would like most. The person I like most is usually the person that I'm working on at the time, and I'm reading a lot of Maynard Keynes at the moment. So Keynes, absolutely someone that I would like. I don't think I'd go down to the pub and have a pint with him. His appetites would be much too refined for that. I would at least have to have claret.
Sure.
But probably champagne.
Yeah. Owen, please.
I don't really have a proper question because, I really enjoy the book and all the people that are in it. I'm going to pick the easy thing, is to say, people that are not in it. But one of my favorite economists doesn't get a mention, Henry George.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'd like your thoughts on Henry George, just because I never asked you before.
Right. Okay. Right. Henry George is someone I haven't thought about properly for at least 20 years. So. Time has faded my memories of him, but yes, very important in terms of applied policy, I would say. And so someone who simply didn't fit in. And I suppose that actually, why didn't I mention the American institutionalists? I suppose that one of the stories I wanted to tell was about these sophisticated Europeans being hired by rich American universities when Europe was falling apart during the Great Depression and bringing the patina of civilization with them. So George wouldn't fit into that story, unfortunately, really. So yeah, that's why I haven't included him. Just didn't fit into what I wanted to talk about.
Question there in the back, please.
Can I ask you about the influence of Einstein? So Einstein's special theory in 1905 and the general theory in 1915 really create a fundamental stir in Cambridge and, of course, in Vienna. So Hayek is through Moritz Schlitt, is very aware of Einstein's work. And of course, Keynes pays for Wittgenstein ultimately to come back to work with Russell and Whitehead on the rewriting of the Mathematica Principia, Newton's work. And at the time, people like Pigou were convinced that Keynes's general theory was precisely called the general theory to, if you like, follow on from to do for economics what Einstein had done for physics and maths. And yet, a century on, Einstein seems to have disappeared from the economics books. But at the time, it was a really big fundamental shock. I mean, it destroyed the axioms of maths as it existed at the time. And it certainly consumed a lot of Keynes's interest as to how Einstein's work would be accommodated, time and space, within economics.
And when you say a general theory, it is very clear from reading Keynes in the early 1930s that he was thinking of a general theory in exactly that sense, that when he talked about classical economics, he was thinking about something rather like classical Newtonian mechanics. I just came across a really interesting letter from Keynes, written I think 1931, where he talked about how economics as a science is really not as well developed as physics particularly, and that it's going to take 30 years of good work, during which time economists are going to be, economics will be at the center of intellectual attention, and then after 30 years economics will fade back into the background. Now, I think, well, I'm fairly clear that what Keynes thought he was doing was providing a kind of economics which would be able to explain something like the Great Depression, which he believed classical economics, as he did, which was effectively what he defined as everything up until then, taking particularly Pigou, in fact, when he was writing the general theory, that Keynes thought that he had been able to explain a much wider range of phenomena. And Pigou recognized, even in a fairly hostile review, that Keynes had done something about the economy that nobody else had thought of. So certainly I think that there is very much, there certainly are very much relationships. I know that Keynes visited Einstein in Princeton in 1934 when he was over in Columbia, well, in fact, on his way from Columbia to where he got his honorary degree down to DC, where he met Roosevelt and all sorts of other politicians. So yes, so Keynes was certainly thinking about Einstein as being important at that time.
Question from Mark, and then.
First of all, congratulations on quite an achievement. I want to ask a question about economics and economists being a bit self-critical. And it follows on nicely from the physics question, which is there's something in physics known jokingly as the spherical cow. You've probably heard of it, where the joke is that a farmer is concerned about the low productivity of his dairy cows, and there's a university next door, and goes to asks the physics department, it's a professor in the physics department to investigate, and the physicist comes back a little bit later saying, I have a solution, but it only works for spherical cows in a vacuum. And there's this tendency in economics too. Now the critiques or complaints about economics from non-economists often miss the point that what we do and what we teach at very basic levels is, appropriate simplification and benchmarking, and then of something that's really complicated. And but there's this habit, it's or a tendency within economics to sometimes go down the spherical cow route. And I wonder if you saw this in your survey of who you on one extreme you might have the actual physicist in your list, von Neumann, and on the other extreme the political scientist in your list, Ostrom, who was the opposite end, very very practical. What works?
Yes,
studies what works.
Yes.
So
Yes.
please.
And indeed, I think of Ostrom in many ways as being as providing practical explanations of the kind of system that Hayek was trying to think of, which is perhaps not the obvious one. But von Neumann, yes, the man who was so clever that he was confused by people's stupidity. But also, you could see his own inclinations coming out. I mean, there's a story that in 1946-47 he was trying to persuade the U.S. government to bomb Russia, and this reflected not just his innate conservatism, but also his experience as a Hungarian. Once politics and economics come together, you can't have that. I think that one of the things which actually I started to see was how difficult it is to do something for the first time. So the first really bad book in economics is Ricardo's Principles. And Ricardo had to be persuaded by Bentham and James Mill to write it. And James Mill effectively acted as a kind of editor come publisher who was going, no, that won't do, try again. No, really, this is important, you've got to finish it. And Ricardo, well, of course, he was so fantastically rich, he didn't need to write it. But Ricardo was thinking in ways which are familiar to economists now, because he was starting to work through numerical examples to something that could have mathematical representation. And it makes no sense now reading it, but at the time, it was a brilliant advance. So you start off with spherical cows. I mean, at a much more prosaic level, when I'm teaching microeconomics to second and third year students, I say, right, we're going to make these 6 assumptions. And the last one, which I say we're going to relax, is the assumption that knowledge is either freely available or costless to process, or data, I should say. And I say, once we get to that point and we get rid of that, we're into the world of behavioral economics. Goodbye, in fact, to standard economics. We're into psychology. So yes. So doing things for the first time is very difficult. You will start with spherical cows, but those spherical cows can grow legs and start to cope with an atmosphere.
What a question over here.
Thanks for that really interesting talk. I'm not an economist, but I hear a lot in the news at the moment that we're living through very unstable times and very unpredictable society, and it's fair to say that anyone who's lived through the last 5 years has seen a lot of historical events unfold. I was wondering, on your opinion, having read through so many authors, has there ever been an economist who's looked around themselves and thought this is a really stable and predictable economy that I'm looking at right now?
Great question.
Irving Fisher, September 1929. Yes, we have. The stock market has reached a new plateau. Took 35 years for it to get back to that level. So, yes. I mean, that's a short answer to the question. Economists have always I think that that actually comes back to my point. In fact, sorry, can I go back to one thing? You said you're not an economist. Can I challenge you on that?
Okay.
Because we all live in the economy, because we all have to make decisions which are fundamentally economic, we are all, in some sense, economists. And one of the things which I wanted to do when I was writing the book is to challenge the notion that somehow there's this kind of sacred priesthood, which is infallible, that understands the economy. Not true at all. So in some sense, if you're not an economist, or if you're not a trained economist, you're the kind of person that I was writing the book for, because you are already having to think about the economy, and you should discover that thinking like an economist is putting a bit of formality onto things which you're already doing. Now, in that context, what does it mean to think like an economist? I've mentioned this economist's love of messiness and the fact that things are always contingent and are always changing. I've mentioned Smith, but let me just turn this into one about Hayek. Hayek essentially believed that the economy evolves as people are in the economy. It's not that the economy is somewhere out there and fixed, and we are working on it. We are working on it. The economy is composed of the decisions which we are making, and the decisions which we are making will recreate the economy automatically. So in Hayek's approach to economics, there never could be such a thing as a stable state, really. And that's why one of the many reasons why he was so opposed to mathematical economics, which had any concept of equilibrium in it.
We have time for one more question. It's over there.
Hi, Robbie. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'd just like to ask a question about the process of writing a project like this. I'd like to ask that question because I was fortunate enough to be a part of, in first semester of this year, a course which was largely a very slimmed down version of this book, and we was fortunate enough to read parts of the book as they came out and whatnot. And in my early stages of economic training, it was going through this evolution of thought. It really changed and developed my understanding of how economics is approached. I'd like to ask how, when writing this book, how many times were you surprised with how different your views were perhaps early in your career, and then more broadly, can you pinpoint a particular person or a particular paper in your career which has changed either your or your peers' understanding of things? Was there like a particular paper or idea that sort of changed things?
So you didn't use ChatGPT?
No, I used my students. I mean, if I'm going to plagiarize, I at least want to use something intelligent. But gosh, things which particularly strike me. I mean, no one told me The Wealth of Nations was difficult, so it was the first economics book I read. I remember when I was doing my undergraduate dissertation, almost getting run down in St Andrews because I was thinking, that's what Keynes meant in the general theory. I can also remember very vividly being told in first year that Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, Schumpeter's great survey of economic conditions in the early 1940s, was absolutely essential reading. So I went off and devoured it. And again, no one told me these books were difficult. And you know, that I think, those books, almost every page I would turn them and I'd go, wow, this is amazing. But actually the one which particularly strikes in my mind, not the paper itself. My copy of The Economist was delivered by post in those days. It came through the letterbox on Saturday morning. I sat drinking a cup of coffee and read a school's brief on Akerlof's market for lemons. At the time I was working for Bank of Scotland. By the time I'd finished, I thought, I'm going to do a master's degree. Because at St Andrews, where we'd been taught all sorts of really interesting things, I managed to do a course, which was a program which was almost entirely macroeconomics. And the fact that you could do this sort of thing in microeconomics, and then once I was at university, I discovered you can take it from micro into macro. This all just seemed so fascinating. That's what I wanted to do when I became an economist. Essentially, I wanted to build on the Akerlof-Yellen type of near-rationality models. And my supervisor went away for a semester, and I discovered Kahneman and Tversky. And I didn't do macro anymore. I didn't really do economics anymore. I did philosophy, I did psychology, I did some political economy, and I've never really recovered. So there we are.
So you're not an economist after all?
I think about the economy. I must be an economist.
Well, on that note, let's give Robbie a round of applause.